Now, before we move over to Substance Painter, there's a couple things I want to adjust here. First, I noticed if I lean back, the face goes away. So this user here, you can see as I lean back, it starts clipping out. So we just need to take this material and turn off depth test and depth buffer. And that way, it'll stay back there no matter what. And you can see on this face mesh, the cheeks are just completely in shadow. And that's because this directional light is at a 45-degree angle. So if we just rotate this and make it a little bit straight on, now we're not getting as harsh of shadows in the side of the face, but still enough to see the definition. And I think for these eyes, we might need to cut these out because we're getting that extra detail there and it's not matching up. So I think we just need to do it on this top one. And the mouth too, it looks like. Now it seems like this is fitting pretty well. And we're going to work on the alpha in Substance, so we don't need to worry about this hard edge right now. Now let's open up Substance Painter and start texturing this. I'll pull in the FBX directly into Substance. And that will automatically fill this. And the template is Spark AR Studio. And for now we'll work at 2K resolution. And we can actually import the mesh map right here because we already baked the AO and the normals. Now down here, if we click on project, we can see both the AO and the normals. So we can add those directly into our mesh maps here. Now you can see that's applied to the mesh. And now let's bake the rest of these. We'll go 2K again. And we don't need to do normals or ambient occlusion. And we only have one solid object, so we don't need an ID as well. And then bake the textures. Now to get started, let's add a metal material to this chin. So we'll go over to layers, and then down here, we can clear this filter, and then type metal. And to see these better, we can make these thumbnails large, and then just pull this up temporarily. You can see there's a lot of options. I'll just start with steel stained, and drag that right in. And I can delete this empty layer here. Now this material looks pretty nice. It's fairly clean, but there's a little bit of wear and a little bit of grunginess, and we can tone that down too. Let's tone that down first, and then we can paint this mask. So click on the folder icon to twirl this down, and I think it's the dirt that we need to work with. So really, we can just turn this opacity down, and this dirt will be a lot more minimal. And you can see, even though I turn this to 0, there's still an effect, and that's because we're only working on the base color layer. There's still the height, roughness, and all these as well. So if we click on this, we can see what's going on. So you can see the roughness is set up a bit, and then metallic is set all the way down. So that's why these areas in here are looking a little gray. If we change these, you can see the difference isn't as big. Now let's start masking this. So we can close this, and then right-click, and add a black mask, which will make everything go away. And then we'll switch over to the 2D view. And we want to paint kind of this area down here. So for this, we want a fairly hard brush. So we'll clear this and go to brushes. And any hard brush will do. I have this nice Photoshop brush that's imported in, so I'm just going to use that. And now I'm just going to kind of trace along here. And if you want a straight edge, you can single click and then hold shift, and you get this nice line. And then click again, and it'll paint directly between those two. And you can see when my brush goes over here, it's not painting on the mesh, and that's because we have tangent projection on. If we go over to alignment, we can change this to UV. And now when we paint, it paints exactly where the brush is. So that's why there's this little notch here. If we do this again, it should clean it out. And you can also see it's getting smaller and larger. And in this case, I think I just want it to stay the same size. So for size space, we'll just turn this to viewport. Now it's the same size no matter where we are. And already that's looking pretty good. Now we want a little bit of definition between the metal and this plastic rubber. So if we set the height to the metal lower, or vice versa, set this to a higher height, then we'll get a little bit of a lip here. So we need to go into the material and check the height settings for each of these. And to better see this, we can change it from base color to height. And that way we can see where all the height information is coming from. It looks like all of these are white. So what we can do is add a fill layer and make sure it's inside of this folder. And it doesn't really matter where it is, because we're going to turn everything off except for this height here. And now as we increase the height, you can see there's a lip here. It's kind of like a normal map type of information. It's not actual geometry, but it's just telling it that this height is bigger than this height. Actually, we want it to be the other way. So it's more of a lip. So now you can see this edge here has more definition. Without this, it just looks pretty fake. Now to add some color to this, we're going to make these indents blue. And we're going to use a smart mask to do that. So let's close this steel and make a new layer. Make sure it's outside of here. And we'll change this to a nice bright blue. And for this one, we also need to make a black mask. And then right-click the mask and add a generator. And this will essentially generate some mask information. So with this selected, we'll click this button here and add a mask editor. And automatically it kind of tries to guess what we might want to do. So if we turn up this global contrast, we can see what's going on better. And then adjust the balance. So it looks like it's just grabbing all these convex surfaces and edges. So scrolling down, there's this micro normal section. So if we go back to our project and pull in our normal map, that doesn't do anything yet. But then under micro details, for micro normal, we want to turn that on. So with the normal map in this micro normal, we can actually remove all these other channels. And then you can see it's starting to cut out these little indents. So at the top here, we need to invert this. Now you can see it's starting to get a little bit of blue in there. So in curvature intensity, I'm going to turn that all the way up. And these sliders don't do anything because we're not using the height or AO. And none of these sliders will do anything except the curvature one here. As you can see, it doesn't really do anything until we get below the threshold. And then these global values here. So right now, this is looking pretty rough. There's little pixels here, and then it's a little chunky here. So if we turn up this global blur just a teeny bit, that removes all that noise and then kind of builds out these lines more. And we want global contrast to be all the way up. If we start turning it down, we start losing these edges and we get a little extra detail in there. And then global balance we'll play with until we get a good, nice set of lines, and we can paint out all these extra bits in a second. So this seems like a good balance between, decent lines here and then not too much noise. So to fix the noise, we can right click and add a paint. And then with our brush, we want it to be black, so it'll paint out. And you can hit X to toggle between black and white. You can see that down here in the grayscale section. Now we can just paint out all this extra noise. And some of it you might want to leave, like the eyes could look cool, but for now I'm just gonna kind of clean up all this. Now, if we want to clean up some of these edges here that are kind of splotchy, we can switch back to white and just paint on anything that we want. So making the brush small enough, I can just kind of hold shift and tap through here and paint these a little bit more solid. Now that looks good for the blue lines. Now let's switch back to 3D view to see how we're doing. That's looking pretty cool. And in this white area here, we actually don't have anything going on. If we switch to base color, you can see that's transparent. So we do want that because we want to see part of the face. Only the jaw and the chin will be fully metallic. The rest of the face will just be a little bit shiny. But I think we should add a few more details to the metal down here. So let's add a new fill layer. And then right click and make a black mask. So it's invisible for now. And then we want this to be elevated a little bit. So under the height, we'll turn this up just a bit. So now as we paint on, we should get some height information as well as this color information. And we'll switch back to our basic material or material view. Now you can see it looks like this is elevated because we've turned the height of this fill layer up just a little bit. You can see I can adjust it on the fly here, which is really handy because if you just make a paint layer and then paint a bunch of information, you have no controls. Whatever is painted, the color, the height information, that's all baked in. With the fill layer, you have all this control, so you can tweak stuff, make it look however you need to. So I can just undo that a few times. And for now, let's just paint height information and not actually color. So we can turn the rest of these off. So now when we paint on here, we're just elevating this metal a little bit. So earlier we were using these hard surface normals to add kind of depth information, but this time we're going to use alphas now that we're using this fill layer with height. So I've purchased a pack of alphas. It's this hard surface height alpha map pack. And it comes with a bunch of these really high res alphas, and you can see kind of a demo of how they look on this model. And this is $6. You can find free packs of alphas online, or you can even make your own by just making grayscale images. So I'm going to be using some of these. So if you click this little filter, you can open up this kind of folder view. And I have all of these saved here in these JRO hard surface folder. So to start, let's add some bolts. Looks like this star one might look cool. So by single clicking that, it adds that to the brush. So I should be able to click and it'll just paint that alpha right on there. And you can see there's some distortion. The brush looks round, but this is definitely not round. So we'll undo that. And up here under alignment, let's change this back from UV to tangent wrap. So as we move this around, you can see it contours to the surface. So now when we click this, we get this nice perfect circle. And it looks cool, but it doesn't look correct. It looks like the edge is high and it kind of looks like this is inverted. So if we select this fill layer, we can pull this height down to a negative, and now it looks like it's actually stamped on. And I don't want this here, so I'm just going to add a black mask just to clear that out. And now I'll start going around, just adding a few of these around the edge here. And because this is a symmetrical object, we can enable symmetry here. And you can see the axis is drawn here. So now as we stamp, they'll be stamped on both sides. And now let's look at these alphas and see what else we can add. I like this vent here. So just single clicking that assigns that alpha. Now let's see, maybe back behind the jaw you would have a vent for steam or something. And that looks cool. You can see it's applied to both sides. And you may notice it looks a little strange here that everything is metallic, even these holes here. So let's try turning back on the color for this layer and see if we can make it where these deeper parts are darker. Because we're using alpha, these parts here are kind of the most intense, and so this might actually look good. So just by turning on color with the color of black, you can see these details look a lot more realistic. And if it's too strong, you can of course, lighten that up. But I think black looks pretty great because these kind of fall off. And once you start adding a bunch of stuff, it's good to make a new layer. That way, if you need to adjust anything, you have control for separate pieces. So I'll just duplicate this by holding Control, and then right-click and add a black mask just to clear that. So this way, if I add this panel here, you can see it's overlapping there, but then I can just go and erase this overlapping section, and it doesn't erase this vent here. You can even erase these details, and then it kind of pulls that surface back up. And I actually don't like this, so I'll just create another black mask on there. It seems like this cheek area could also use a vent. So let's try this kind of Venetian blind vent. And again, let's make a new layer and make sure this has a black mask. Actually, this one was empty, so we can just delete that one. And now I'll just paint a couple of these going down. And to rotate, just hold Control, left click, and then drag up and down. And I should start by lining up with this bottom here. And it looks like there's some distortion going on. So instead of using tangent wrap, let's use camera. That way it just shoots straight out from the camera view. Try this again. That looks decent. Now we just have to go and erase all this overlap here. And now we have this nice kind of vent hole here. We can turn off symmetry to hide that line. That's looking pretty cool. I'm just going to go through and add a few more tiny details to this metal area. And to switch from perspective to orthographic, hit F5 for perspective and F6 for orthographic. And then hold Shift to snap to these different angles. All right, now let's see how we can export this back into Spark. Before we go and export these, we need to check each channel just to make sure everything's in order. So hitting the C key will cycle between all the different channels. So we have base color here, which looks good. Height looks good. Roughness seems to look good. Metallic is good. Normal is good. Now opacity looks wrong. Looks like opacity is only on these lines and not on the metal jaw. So let's make sure we turn this on. Under, I think, steel base over here. Let's turn on opacity. Okay, that adds that, but it still looks like there's a little bit of detail there. And it's black. I think we want this to be white. Let's just keep moving up and see if we can find all these opacities. Now the dirt is all the way up. For sharpen, we can turn that on, which doesn't do anything. Okay, so it's still not quite right. You can see we're looking at opacity still, but we have a lot of different color values here, and ideally this whole thing is white. So let's switch this over to opacity. And an easy fix for this would be to make a new fill layer, and then keep it at the top here, but turn off everything other than opacity. So now we're basically overwriting all these opacities and just setting it to 1 right here. So now this jaw is totally opaque. And so are these lines. But it looks like the little indents we made here are not visible yet. And I did a poor job at naming these, so I'm going to go through and just rename these. So it looks like the only alpha detail that's missing are the little screw holes that go along the top part of the face, the top part of this jawline. So we just need to select this and then turn on opacity. And now we can see those here. And those are just these little guys here. So I believe that should do it. Let's save here and then go to File, Export Textures. And we're using the Spark AR Studio preset. We want PNGs at 1024 pixels. And then just click Export. And then open Output Directory to look at the textures. Now it looks like the diffuse here, the alpha didn't work. We have this gray color here, and if I hit Shift A in this program, it toggles the alpha, and you can see it's toggling these little stripes out here, but not this middle section. So we need to fix this. So I believe the easiest way to do this is to go back to opacity, and on the very bottom, we'll drop a fill layer. We'll turn everything off other than opacity, and we'll turn this to 0. So now you can see up here it's actually black instead of checkerboarded. So now it'll write basically 0 in the alpha in this area. So let's export again. And if we keep with the same folder, it should overwrite what we had just done. Let's open again. And now you can see this area is completely black. And if I hit Shift A, you can see it toggles the alpha. So it's working. And emissive we're still not using, so I'll delete that. The normal map looks great. And the ORM looks confusing as always, but probably good. And before we even get these into Spark, let's just open up Crushy and compress these a little bit. I'll keep these as pings, so I'll do not convert those. Resolution will keep the same. We just want to compress it a little bit. It looks like this saved about 50% of the size. Detail looks pretty similar. Not bad. Yeah, these look good. So I'll save to folder. Then select this folder here. Make a new folder for crushed images, and then select that. So now we have our smaller textures saved. We can close Crushy, close this, and open Spark back up. And as you can see, we still have this face mesh with the deformation working. We just need to add all these textures on top. So let's see where we left it off. We have this base face warped mesh, which just gives that deformation in the cheeks. And then on top of that is where we're going to add all the texture. And we already have this material started, so we'll just hop into that. And let's switch this to physically based. And we'll drag in these 3 textures. And you can see it's trying to compress them already, so we need to select those, tell it not to by clicking no compression. And now let's add these to this material. We have our texture, or our color texture. We have our ORM, and we have our normal here. And to make the ORM work, we need to crank these all the way up so that they take effect. I'm going to pause the video so I can see the mesh over here better. Now it looks like it's working okay, but we're not getting any reflections here because we don't have an environment yet. So we'll toggle that on. And we don't have anything saved yet, so we'll search for the AR library. And I always like using the sunset one because it's pretty bright. Now you can see the face is so far back that it's behind this. So I think what we need to do with this hallway is just scale it up. Maybe we can scale it back too, just so we have some extra space to work with. Now this is starting to look good, but we still have a bit of work to do. Selecting this main face texture again, I'm going to go into the color texture by double-clicking and change it from linear to sRGB. That way it's not so blown out. And now this looks a little disconnected because we have all this texture on the chin and the cheek, but nothing on the face. So let's make another face mesh. And then for this one, we'll add a new material. Jump into this. We'll make it physically based. And we need to apply the deformation to it. So let's click on the face mesh object again and add that deformation. That way it fits on there. Now back in this material, we'll rename it to matte shiny. And we want to basically make it so the face is a little bit shinier. So we'll use a screen blending mode. Turn the metallic all the way up, the roughness up a little bit. And for the eyes, I think we might want to close the eyes. So let's grab the object, close the eyes just so the shininess goes on those as well. And obviously this is way too intense. The highlights here are clipping out. So in the material, let's increase the roughness, soften that out. And then under the opacity, we can turn it down until it's just a subtle little glow, a subtle little reflection. And for this one, we do want to add the alpha face mesh, kind of alpha blend. So we'll go to texture. I have this saved in my Spark AR texture assets folder. So that blends that on there. Now you can see on the eyes it's clipping because we have 3 layers going on. So there's a few ways we can fix this. An easy way would just be to pull this a little bit forward. Because as you can see, when I pull it, the whole thing goes forward, but then it doesn't clip through. You can see the issue there. And as I do this, it looks like there's a little bit of rotation value. So we want to make sure we're careful with that. So we just want to pull it forward in the Y, or in the Z. So let's try negative 0.01. Okay, that's the wrong direction. So 0.001. Now you can see the edge here is just a little bit forward. And we are maybe clipping this. So we can also make it a teeny bit wider by scaling the X by a teeny bit, maybe 1.001. Maybe a little bit more than that. 0.01. Okay, so now we have this kind of film on the front of the face. And the shiny eyes maybe are a little too intense. So on this material, I'm going to switch it from this smooth circle to this one here that I already have the eyes cut out. And that just kind of softened up that eye area a little bit. Now, one last thing I want to add is some eye color to this. So let's go to the library and type in eye. And we have the eyeball shader and the eye color. And I believe there's also an eye object in the 3D shape folder. So I'm actually just going to start with this. Very simple eyeball. Now we're going to have to do this a little bit more manually. So we'll drop the eyeball inside the eye tracker. And under actions, position on face, and we'll set it to left eyeball. And then move these patches out of the way. So it looks like it's working. It's obviously too far forward, but we can move that back. We'll just take the actual eyeball, and with local coordinates, let's see if we can push that. Now we're getting little bits of rotation value, so we do need to do this manually by typing it in. Let's try 0.001. Okay, it's going to be negative 0.0 something. Looks like that's almost far enough. And to make sure this is visible, let's grab all three of these and make an eye hole there. Then we just need to move the eye back a little bit further. So as you can see, there's still some eyeballs showing up here. The iris here is visible. So we need to go into the face texture that's extracted and enable opening and alignment for the eyes. And that will fix that issue. Now let's choose a different video that's a little bit closer on the face so we can see what we're doing. So we have the eyeball generally in the right place, but it's hard to see what's going on with it totally white. So I'm going to grab the eyeball shader as well. That's just in the AR library. Then we'll make a new material. Call this matte eye. Then click the texture patch dot here, and then connect these two. And then on the eyeball, we'll assign this material. Now we can see what's going on. So we're still getting a lot of this eye color on the top of this hole. So I'm going to add alpha just to cut these out. So for this warped face, I'm using alpha test just to cut this out a little bit further now that I'm using this texture here for the alpha. Now back on this eye, I'm going to adjust the rotation as well on the eyeball model. Actually, it looks like setting the eyeball mesh and not the model will put it in the correct place. So we'll do that for the rotation as well. And that looks good for that eye. Now we can just duplicate that. And then grab the same position and rotation of the other eye. And then connect the eyeball center and the eyeball rotation. So now we got two eyes that are locked on. And to change the color, we could make a texture, or we can just continue using this eyeball shader. And for this, we're going with a kind of techie glowing blue color. And for the, I don't know how to say this, sclera, the opacity here, let's turn it down a bit so we don't get too much of this coloration on the sides of the eyes. Now it looks like we're still getting some clipping on the top of the eye here. Now you can see here when I close my eyes, the eyeballs are clipping through a little bit. So we need to scoot the eyeballs back a teeny bit, I think, just to get rid of that clipping. So adding a value of -0.0015 looks like it pretty much solves that. Maybe there's a teeny bit, but we don't want to push them back too far. Now, I think one limitation we're hitting with using this deformation is that the eyes still clip the top of the iris a little bit. As you see, when I open my eyes really wide, we're still getting some clipping there because the mesh isn't fully opening. And I don't know if there's a good solve for that. So in this lesson, we learned how to do segmentation, add a 3D background or faux 3D background, do some deformation sculpting, normal map baking. Then in Substance Painter, we used alpha stamps to get some really cool normal details along the chin.